Tonight we begin with a development that U.S. officials, NATO commanders, and European defense ministers had feared, anticipated, and desperately prepared for. A massive military assault that unfolded not over weeks or months, but in mere hours. Hours that reshaped the front lines of this devastating conflict. Hours that tested the very foundation of Western alliances. Hours that forced the entire NATO command structure to respond with unprecedented speed and coordination. What Russia did today crossed a line that Washington, London, Berlin, and Brussels had hoped, perhaps naively, would hold. And when that line broke, when that threshold was crossed, NATO did not hesitate. They responded with unity, with resolve, and with overwhelming force projection that we have not seen since the earliest days of this conflict. For months now, there had been signals, not from official Kremlin press releases, not from diplomatic back channels, just signals that Russia was preparing something unprecedented in scale and scope. Russia has been aggressive throughout this conflict, yes, but they have been remarkably calculated in their aggression. Their military moves have followed a certain rhythm, a predictable pattern, almost a strategic doctrine that Western intelligence agencies had learned to read. The spring offensives, the summer consolidations, the autumn repositioning, the winter preparations. But what set off alarm bells in Washington's intelligence community and Brussels' defense headquarters this week was that the pattern went completely silent. Senior intelligence analysts who monitor Russian military movements around the clock know the warning indicators. The unusual troop rotations near the Ukrainian border, the ammunition stockpiling at forward operating bases, the communication surges between regional command centers and Moscow, the movement of mobile artillery systems toward staging areas, the sudden, complete radio silence that precedes major operations. All of that went quiet 3 days ago. The satellite imagery showed movement, but the communications went dark. The supply chains remained active, but the chatter disappeared. And whenever Russia goes quiet like this, it means something is about to get very, very loud. Intelligence veterans with decades of experience tracking Russian military behavior told officials privately that this silence was different. This silence felt intentional. This silence felt like a storm, gathering just beyond the horizon early this morning. At approximately 4:30 a.m. local time, NATO intelligence assets detected what they described as a coordinated multi-axis offensive, including armored divisions that had not been deployed in active combat operations in over 18 months. We're talking about reserve tank battalions. We're talking about elite mechanized infantry units that had been held back, preserved, waiting for exactly this moment. These are the kinds of military assets that Russia only deploys when they are signaling something very specific to the world: territorial expansion beyond current lines, strategic breakthrough toward critical infrastructure, or total escalation designed to fundamentally change the nature of this conflict. Military observers at NATO headquarters didn't know which category this fell into, or whether, terrifyingly, it fell into all three categories at once. But what they did know, with absolute certainty, was that Russia was changing its overall military posture. And when a nuclear-armed superpower shifts its military posture, without explanation, without diplomatic pretext, without the usual propaganda buildup, even by a small margin, the entire Western alliance apparatus pays immediate and intense attention. Phones started ringing in capitals across Europe. Emergency protocols were activated. Military commanders were pulled from their beds. Defense ministers canceled their schedules. The machinery of Western defense began moving before most civilians had finished their morning coffee. The warning issued by the White House tonight was not normal. It was not routine diplomatic language. It was not symbolic posturing for the cameras. It was not carefully hedged bureaucratic communication. It was urgent in a way that stopped seasoned diplomats mid-sentence, senior official after senior official following. Emergency video conferences and crisis meetings described Russia's move in terms that left little room for interpretation, destabilizing to the entire European security architecture, provocative beyond anything seen in recent months. and perhaps most importantly, potentially irreversible without immediate, coordinated Western response. One official, speaking on background, said the mood in the Situation Room was focused but grim. Another described seeing expressions on faces that hadn't been there since the first weeks of the conflict. But here's the critical thing to understand about escalation: strategy. It only works if the target hesitates. It only achieves its objectives if the opposing side pauses, debates, fractures, and delays. NATO did not hesitate. In fact, the alliance's response today was among the fastest and most coordinated military activations we have seen in the entire 3-year span of this conflict. Here's what we know happened in those crucial early hours. Within 3 hours of Russia's initial assault crossing established lines, NATO Secretary-General convened an emergency session. Within 4 hours, the alliance had formally activated elements of its rapid response force. Within 6 hours, orders were being transmitted to bases across Eastern Europe. These weren't the standard rotation troops that cycle through Baltic exercises. These weren't symbolic deployments designed for press conferences. These were elite combat-ready units, personnel, weapons systems, and logistical support structures that NATO only deploys when they are preparing to actively defend alliance territory or demonstrate unmistakable resolve tonight. Pentagon officials confirmed in a rare on-the-record briefing that Ukraine launched immediate counterstrikes on Russian staging areas, including a forward command post that had recently been upgraded with advanced communication equipment for what analysts believe was the purpose of coordinating exactly this type of large-scale assault. The Ukrainian response was remarkable in its speed and precision. Ukraine struck before Russia could consolidate their initial territorial gains. They hit ammunition depots that were feeding the advancing columns. They hit fuel storage facilities, without which armored vehicles become expensive stationary targets. They hit mobile command units that were actively directing the next phase of the assault. They hit radar installations that were providing targeting data for Russian artillery. They hit logistics hubs that were processing supplies for forward units. In other words, Ukraine targeted the nervous system of the entire offensive operation, the logistics backbone that would have made a sustained advance operationally viable, the communication infrastructure that allowed commanders to coordinate complex multi-unit maneuvers. This is precisely what made Washington's warning so urgent and so specific. Russia's assault wasn't just a symbolic show of force designed for domestic propaganda. It was tactically actionable. It represented the kind of operational move that could fundamentally alter the battlefield geometry if left unchecked for even 48 hours. And Ukraine, understanding that reality fully, understanding that delay meant disaster, responded with force, not recklessly, as some might do in panic, not impulsively, as emotions might dictate, but strategically, with the kind of precision that comes from months of experience and extensive intelligence preparation. They didn't strike population centers in retaliation. They didn't escalate beyond legitimate military targets. They didn't waste precious munitions on symbolic gestures. They hit command infrastructure with surgical accuracy. They hit supply lines with devastating effectiveness. They hit exactly what needed to be hit to stop the assault's momentum. And here's where the story becomes even more significant. In the broader strategic context, senior intelligence officials now believe that Russia's latest move was carefully designed to test the cohesion of NATO after months of visible political divisions in Western capitals. Think about the context. Budget debates in Washington, election uncertainty in multiple European countries, growing war fatigue among some Western publics, questions about ammunition supplies and production capacity. Russia wanted to see whether the alliance would fracture under sudden, intense pressure. They wanted to see whether the cracks that have been discussed endlessly in opinion pages and cable news segments would actually become operational breaks. But instead, the exact opposite happened. NATO didn't splinter along national lines. NATO didn't descend into endless committee deliberations. NATO didn't issue weak statements calling for dialogue. They issued a unified operational response that was so swift, so well coordinated, so clearly rehearsed, that even the Kremlin's usually dismissive spokespersons noticed. You don't get Moscow's attention easily after 3 years of conflict. They have become accustomed to Western statements. They have learned to discount diplomatic language. They have grown comfortable with the pace of committee decision-making. But today, NATO got their attention in a way that diplomatic cables never could. Defense analysts, speaking with major international outlets under condition of anonymity, described Russia's tactical shift as a strategic probe, a calculated way to measure Western resolve at a moment of perceived vulnerability. But NATO proved today that they remain both fundamentally united and operationally capable. Their force deployments were not only rapid in timing, they were calibrated so precisely, in scale and positioning, that Russian forces noticed significantly increased activity on their strategic flanks within hours of their own assault beginning. The timing matters enormously because it demonstrates that NATO intelligence integration actually works in practice, not just in planning documents. It shows that the alliance is not a passive observer issuing press releases from comfortable capitals. They are an active, engaged participant in real-time deterrence operations. As reports continued coming in throughout the day from multiple sources across the region, we learned considerably more about the true scale of NATO's coordinated response. The United States repositioned additional F-35 fighter squadrons to bases in Poland, forcing Russian air defense commanders to divert significant assets away from supporting their ground offensive. Britain deployed additional armored infantry units to the Baltic states, forces that had been placed on high readiness in the last 72 hours as intelligence warnings accumulated. Germany, operating from logistics bases across Eastern Europe, reportedly activated the full NATO supply network used to provide ammunition and equipment to frontline Ukrainian positions. France increased air patrol activity over alliance airspace to levels not seen in months. Polish forces moved to enhanced defensive positions along their eastern border in coordination with Allied units. This wasn't just diplomatic posturing for cameras. This wasn't just press release deterrence. This was operational military movement on a significant scale. This was strategic messaging through force positioning that even the most dismissive Kremlin analyst could not ignore. And strategic messaging through military capability is the one thing Russia has consistently struggled to control or counter since this conflict began. For every tactical advance they have made on the ground, Ukraine and NATO have countered with something that fundamentally complicates their strategic calculus. Remember, Russia thought this entire operation would be over in weeks when it began. They thought Ukrainian resistance would collapse without sustained Western military support. They thought NATO would eventually lose interest as domestic. Political priorities shifted. They thought European unity would shatter over energy costs and economic pressure. They thought American attention would drift to other global challenges. But tonight, the exact opposite of every single one of those assumptions is demonstrably happening. Ukraine is fighting back with precision, determination, and increasingly sophisticated capabilities. NATO is more unified in practical, operational terms than at any point since the height of the Cold War. European governments have maintained sanctions despite significant economic costs to their own populations. And the West is demonstrating through actions, not just words, that it will not abandon its commitments regardless of how long this conflict continues. What makes this particular moment so strategically critical and so genuinely dangerous is that Russia's latest move happened at a time when Vladimir Putin is under immense and growing internal pressure from multiple directions simultaneously. Military hardliners in Moscow want total victory and territorial maximization at any cost. Economic pragmatists in the government want some form of negotiated settlement before sanctions cause irreversible damage. Regional military commanders want more resources, more equipment, and more authority to conduct operations. Political elites with business interests want stability and predictability. They can plan around. Nationalist commentators with media. Platforms want escalation and are publicly criticizing any hint of restraint. Putin is attempting to balance all of these competing demands while simultaneously managing a military operation that has lasted far longer and cost far more than anyone in Moscow initially planned. And when leaders in that kind of pressurized position make sudden, dramatic military moves, history teaches us they're rarely doing it from a position of genuine strength. They're doing it from pressure. They're doing it from a sense of narrowing options. They're doing it from vulnerability masked as aggression. The White House's formal statement, now distributed to all NATO allies and key global partners, was clearly designed to signal that Washington is not willing to allow any Russian territorial gains from this assault to go unanswered or normalized. Senior officials said plainly, in unusually direct language, that Russia's assault was inconsistent with international norms, fundamentally destabilizing to European security, and will be met with appropriate and proportional response in coordination with our allies. That is diplomatic language for, we see exactly what you're doing. We understand what you're attempting, and we will act decisively. You simply don't hear that specific tone and that particular combination of words from this administration unless something genuinely serious is perceived to be at stake. This wasn't boilerplate condemnation. This was a message crafted for an audience of one in Moscow. Meanwhile, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky addressed the nation in a defiant yet carefully measured speech broadcast tonight across Ukrainian media and shared immediately worldwide. He said, "Russia believes it can break our spirit with force and terror. Once again, they are profoundly wrong." He said, "Every missile they launch at our people only strengthens our determination. Every assault only deepens our commitment." And he said, "We will defend every meter of our land with everything we have, and the democratic world stands united with us in this defense." These are not rhetorical flourishes designed for international headlines. These are not empty words meant for momentary encouragement. These are statements from a wartime leader representing a nation that understands, perhaps better than anyone else on Earth right now, just how extraordinarily high the stakes have become. Here's what makes the current situation even more concerning for analysts watching global security dynamics. Russia's latest ground assault wasn't an isolated tactical decision, along with the primary armored offensive that dominated this morning's headlines. Russian cyber units also launched coordinated attacks on Ukrainian electrical infrastructure and communication systems, attempting to blind defenders at a critical moment. Wagner-affiliated mercenary forces and similar irregular units increased their operational tempo in southern sectors, attempting to stretch Ukrainian defensive resources. Russian naval assets significantly increased their activity in the Black Sea, conducting maneuvers that appeared designed to threaten critical shipping routes. Russian strategic bomber forces conducted unusual patrol patterns that prompted NATO air defense activations. All of this happened within the same 48-hour operational window. When Russia moves this many different pieces simultaneously across this many different domains, it means something considerably larger than a localized offensive is underway. It means coordinated strategic pressure. It means Moscow is attempting to create multiple crises simultaneously. Military analysts and intelligence officials are now actively considering several distinct possibilities for what Russia's ultimate objectives might be. One possibility is that Russia is preparing for a major winter offensive designed to achieve territorial gains before spring weather enables Ukrainian counter-operations. Another possibility is that Russia is attempting to create battlefield leverage that could be traded for favorable terms in potential future negotiations. A third possibility, and this is the one quietly worrying senior officials the most, is that Russia is attempting to test whether NATO would actually, operationally, kinetically defend its easternmost member states if pushed. But today, NATO took that question definitively off the table. They didn't wait for additional evidence and clarification. They didn't limit themselves to issuing carefully worded statements of concern. They didn't seek extended deliberation through multiple committee layers. They mobilized actual military forces to actual positions. That answers the question, what we're watching unfold now is fundamentally a test of resolve on multiple levels. Russia wants to see if the Western alliance will finally crack under sustained pressure and war fatigue. Ukraine wants to demonstrate to the world that it can withstand any assault Moscow launches. NATO wants to prevent further escalation while maintaining credible deterrence. The European Union wants to preserve unity despite economic strain. And China, notably, conspicuously, almost deafeningly silent throughout all of today's dramatic developments, clearly wants to avoid being drawn into publicly choosing sides in a conflict that offers Beijing no obvious strategic benefit. That silence from Beijing is itself a message. It's a message to Moscow that support has limits. It's a message to Washington that neutrality remains the preference. It's a message to the world that China is watching, calculating, and waiting. Tonight, as this broadcast airs, we've heard from senior defense officials who are actively monitoring Russian troop movements and communications in real time. They say Russian forces have taken significant and unexpected casualties in the initial assault phase, with some units reporting equipment losses that will take weeks to replace. They say Ukrainian counterstrikes have successfully disrupted Russian command and control networks, forcing field commanders to rely on less secure backup systems. They say the assault's momentum has already slowed considerably from what Russian planners likely anticipated. And they say Russia's decision to escalate now is almost certainly part of a broader strategic calculation intended to force Western leaders toward negotiation on Moscow's preferred terms before spring arrives. But Ukraine is not backing down. In fact, Ukrainian military leadership is preparing additional counter-operations targeting the vulnerabilities exposed by Russia's extended offensive posture. Ukraine's response today, swift, precise, operationally devastating, and strategically smart, sent an unmistakable message to Moscow that aggression will always be met with determined, capable resistance. And it sent an equally important message to NATO capitals that Ukraine remains an extraordinarily capable and determined security partner worthy of continued support. As this situation continues to develop over the coming hours and days, we expect significantly more details to emerge about what exactly Russia hoped to achieve with this dramatic escalation. But what we already know with certainty is that NATO's response was timely and appropriate to the moment. It reassured nervous allies on Europe's eastern frontier that Article 5 guarantees mean something real. It deterred potential further escalation by demonstrating genuine capability and genuine will. And it demonstrated to skeptics everywhere that the Western alliance remains both functional and fundamentally united when genuinely tested. What happens next will depend significantly on what Russia decides to do in the next 72 hours. If they attempt to consolidate current positions and dig in, this moment will be remembered as another grinding, tragic phase of an already devastating conflict. If they attempt to push further and expand their offensive, NATO and Ukraine have already demonstrated clearly that they are fully prepared. They have shown they are ready. They have shown they will respond. And they have shown that the cost of aggression will always exceed any possible gain. And tonight, for the first time in several weeks, the Kremlin appears to be genuinely reassessing its assumptions about Western weakness. Moscow is quiet tonight, too quiet. The usual bombastic statements haven't materialized. The typical propaganda messaging is muted. The expected threats haven't been issued. And when Russia is quiet after a major move like this, it means they are calculating. It means they are processing unexpected resistance. It means they are choosing their next move very, very carefully. Because tonight, Russia learned something they have been forced to learn many times throughout this conflict. Ukraine will not surrender, no matter the cost. NATO will not fracture, no matter the pressure. and the world is watching every single move they make. This story is far from over. The next days and weeks will bring new developments, new challenges, and new dangers that we cannot yet fully anticipate. But tonight, as the dust settles on this dramatic day, three things are absolutely clear. The West responded with genuine unity. Ukraine responded with remarkable strength. And Russia's calculated gamble has not produced the quick victory or Western collapse they sought.